Now, from revolutions of 100 years ago to another of 500 years ago, where the priest Martin Luther nailed his thesis to a church door, the 95-point list created a schism in the Catholic Church by questioning current practices like the payment of money for sins to be forgiven. Lutheranism, Calvinism, and Protestantism was just some of what followed. Much of the religious landscape today is colored by what happened then. Reverend Dr. Robert Saller teaches at the Christian Theological Seminary in Indianapolis. And he told us about that moment in history. Did he really nail his thesis to that church door?
It's a remarkably contested issue among Luther scholars as to what actually happened. The joke among Reformation scholars is whether they were nailed or whether they were mailed. Either way, they were posted. So the debate is, did he actually nail them to the castle door, which is plausible given that that would have been common practice in a university town to post various issues for debate and so on. Or did he simply mail them to his superior, the Archbishop of Mainz, in order to alert the Archbishop that this abuse was happening in Luther's territory as well as other places in Germany?
Right, so there is an argument about it ongoing. There's obviously, of course, much discussion about the effect that they go on. This is a dreadful journalistic question, but is it still relevant today?
Certainly, it has its most proximate reference in terms of the beginnings of what would become Protestantism over and against the dominance of the Roman Catholic Church at the time. If you think about that image of this monk in a fairly backwater town in Germany holding a hammer and posting these theses, again, whether or not it actually happened historically that way, in some ways, the historical veracity of it is less interesting than the reception of it, because it has become the iconic image for a kind of assertion of individual conscience over and against perceived authority. And again, that's an image that spills out far beyond the realm of religion. So, in many ways, Luther opened a kind of Pandora's box of conscience, which redounded out even to what we would think of now as secularism.
Nevertheless, people would be justified in also looking at Luther's heritage in another way and going, this unleashed mayhem and murder and just brutality on a sectarian level right across Europe as well. There's a warning to history from Luther as well, isn't there?
I think that's right. That has its roots, in some ways, even in Luther's own temperament. One of the things that a Lutheran such as myself has to be very honest about would be the shameful legacy that Luther has, for instance, in his anti-Jewish writings, and also his utter hostility towards people that disagreed with him theologically. And then, yes, when you look at the ways in which the division of the church and the breakup of this cultural and political institution that had held so much together, the inevitable outcome of that, I think, was first a kind of existential violence, which soon became physical violence. And you had the horrific wars, the 30 Years' War and so on, following in the wake of the Reformation. And you also had the rise of the nation state over and against the church, which claimed victims of its own. So, yes, the Reformation in many ways is a bloody business as well.
You seem almost to have reservations about him. I feel you might not have liked him that much if you'd met him. You would have found him disputatious.
Well, there are multiple sides. I admire his passion so much. Where I think 500 years later we might dispute with Luther himself would be around the question of how we treat those who disagree with us. One of the things that's very striking now is that 500 years later, worldwide commemorations around the Reformation are being planned jointly between Lutherans and Roman Catholics, including the Vatican. So, in other words, what began as a harsh break between the Protestant and the Roman Catholic Church, now 500 years later in many quarters is being commemorated towards a new kind of unity. And I think there might have been a side of Luther that would have really welcomed that, but in a way, looking upon those whom we disagree and seeking to learn from them rather than condemn is an advance that we've made over Luther's time.
There you are. That's taking in quite a lot of recent history. That was the Reverend Dr. Robert Saylor, who teaches at the Christian Theological Seminary in Indianapolis on the significance of Luther. There's a bit of a discussion, he said, of who was the greater revolutionary, Lenin or Luther, 100 years ago or 500 years ago. The Reverend Robert, firmly of the opinion that without Luther, you may well not have had Lenin, certainly not in the form in which we did have him. Bless him. On the subject of revolutionaries, it was the French novelist Flaubert, I think, has got the best line. He said, inside the breast of every revolutionary beats the heart of a policeman. And the description by the Reverend Robert of Luther telling you off for disagreeing with him kind of
just fits the bill.
It just kind of fits the bill. This is Newsday from the BBC.